Hello, everyone. I hope that everybody's doing great today. Welcome to our class. This is YUM039, and this is Sir E, your facilitator for this course. And let us now begin our discussion. And our topic for today is all about utilitarianism. Again, our discussion for today will be about utilitarianism. Now, in 2016, the newly elected president during that time of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, started his campaign against drugs as soon as he was sworn into power. Now, the police were tapped for this operation, and soon enough, drug users and drug pushers have been rounded up. There have been a large number of arrested, and some of them killed drug pushers and drug users. However, there were reports of casualties who were mistakenly identified as involved in drugs. There also have been reports of extrajudicial killings, as some of those who were shot were allegedly have not even had the chance to fight. Critics have demanded a stop against these alleged unwarranted killings. Taking a hard stance on the government's policy, President Duterte vowed to continue the war up to the end of his term. And he was quoted saying, if you can check on your screen right now, he said, "We do not enjoy killing. That is not a good policy. But 42% of barangays are contaminated with drugs, while 9,000 policemen are in the shabu business. I will walk not only the extra mile, but I will walk for one day to find it. But in the meantime, I will not allow my country to go to the dogs," he said. But he said that he could not just wait for the drug menace to worsen. Okay? He continued, when I was mayor of Davao City, all I said was, "Do not destroy my city." And I this city. When I became president, I said, "I am a president, not a soldier, not a policeman." And so you have to consider the what? I am trying to build a nation. That's what he said. Allow me space to build a nation. Okay. Now, several moral issues have been raised, okay, with the implementation on the war on drugs. And as the war continues, another battle has started with the Duterte administration on one side and the advocates of human rights on the other side. The president had been clear of this point that though mistakes might be made at the price of a life, though he strongly said that those who will err, if there was no fairness, then punishment will be meted to the erring policeman. The war will continue, as this will be basically for good of the state and of its citizens. Again, welcome to our discussion. This is all about utilitarianism. Then part of the topics that we will be covering here today are the following. We will be looking at the origins and the nature of the utilitarian theory. Also, we will look at Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill's concept of utilitarianism. And lastly, we will be concentrating as well on the utilitarianism in business with the following learning objectives in mind. First, we will try to understand and define utilitarianism. Number two, we will appreciate the value of utilitarianism. Also, we will assess when to use utilitarianism and also hopefully be able to apply utilitarianism. Then let me just continue on that again. Our discussion for today is all about utilitarianism. Now, according to an English folklore, there was an outlaw named Robin Hood of Locksley. The story of Robin Hood romanticizes the idea of an outlaw, okay, who steals not for himself, but for others. And he usually steals from the rich people who have been abusive of the poor people. Now, this in effect makes him a hero. The question, though, is this: do you think that Robin Hood is wrong in stealing from other people? Or you think it's okay since he is trying to take it from bad people anyway? Now, if one agrees or even applauds of Robin Hood's acts, then there is a strong chance that one is a utilitarian. Now, when we talk about utilitarianism, a utilitarian believes that an action is morally right if it maximizes, okay, the overall well-being and happiness. Now, the moral standards is based on the consequences of the action, okay, and not of the act. Let me repeat that. The moral standard is based not on the act, but on the consequence of the moral act, because you have to understand, people, that what Robin Hood does is stealing. Okay. However, in utilitarianism, okay, the moral standard is not about what one did, but the consequence of the action. So if the act will result in happiness and well being of the majority, the poor people whom he was able to help, then the act is considered good. In the case of Robin Hood, though the act of stealing might be considered as bad, in this situation, this will be deemed good by the utilitarians. The act of stealing has resulted in the happiness of more people, namely the poor people, as opposed to the unhappiness of the fewer rich people. Now, how do we define utilitarianism? How do we define utilitarianism? Now, let's look at the concepts of utilitarianism first from the perspective of Jeremy Bentham. According to Jeremy Bentham, the said truth is that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. This guy is the founder of utilitarianism. He is known as the founder of utilitarianism, and he later became an honorary citizen of France because of his strong adherence to justice. Now, Bentham took a cue, okay, from David Hume's empiricism. Again, what is empiricism? When we talk about empiricism, we are after what? Okay, sense of our experience. Now, taking his cue from his definition, okay, from David Hume's definition, Benham concluded that for human beings, we have to understand that the primary motivation, okay, for human beings, okay, there is the primacy of the what we call as a pleasure principle, which what we call as hedonism. Okay, that is what we call as the pleasure principle. Now, here there is a recognition that the primary motivation of human behavior is the desire for pleasure. Okay, that is when one becomes a hedonist, and we try to avoid pain. To define happiness as pleasure and to think that it is the end of man is hedonism. Meaning, when you talk about the pleasure principle and when you say that it is the end goal of man to seek for pleasure, then that is what hedonism is all about. A person who adheres to this concept is what we call as a hedonist. However, in the pursuit of pleasure, one should also think of others' pleasure and not just one's own. So it's not all about the pleasure of the self, but also the pleasure of other people, because one has to think of happiness, the happiness of the community, and not just the happiness of the self. Now, we call this as social hedonism. Okay, this is somehow summarized in the okay, in the ad, the greatest happiness principle, which says the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Therefore, when we talk about a moral decision, it will be based on the result of the act. So, if the act results in the happiness of more people, or if it would benefit the majority of the people in comparison to the suffering of the few, then the act still could be considered as morally good. The intention, the motive, okay, or even the act itself does not play a role at all. Now, if happiness is the measurement, now how is it defined then? Now, Jeremy Bentham believed that happiness is pleasure. And here we will be looking at his what we call as his hedonistic calculus, dependent largely on the probability of the result. Okay, so um, you talk about the hedonistic calculus of Jeremy Bentham. So here we have seven questions. The first one is the question of intensity. And when we talk about the question of intensity, the question would be how strong is the pleasure? The second one is all about the concept of duration. How long does the pleasure last for the people? Next one, we talk about the concept of certainty, meaning how can we be assured that the pleasure will take place? The other concept that we have to consider is the concept of proximity, meaning how soon will pleasure be experienced? Will it be now? Will it be tomorrow? Okay. The fifth one will be all about fecundity. And we say fecundity, it's all about how many times will pleasure be repeated? Will we be able to experience this not just one time, it may be forever or just for today? And the sixth concept will be all about purity. And when we talk about purity, this is a question of the absence of pain. Will there be pain? Okay, so the last concept in Jeremy Bentham's hedonistic calculus is all about the concept of extent. And it's here you will really see the concept of utilitarianism, because the idea of extent in Jeremy Bentham's hedonistic calculus is all about the number of people who will experience pleasure itself. Okay, so you talk about the number of people who will experience pleasure itself, and this is the hedonistic calculus, okay, of Jeremy Bentham. And in this hedonistic calculus, what is very important for us to consider is the concept of extent. Okay, this is when the idea of the pleasure of other people will be taken into consideration. As I said a while ago, we will not be talking about the concept of utilitarianism from the perspective of Jeremy Bentham, but also we will be discussing utilitarianism from the perspective of John Stuart Mill. Now, this is John Stuart Mill. Now, according to John Stuart Mill, this is what he said. He said, I have learned to seek my happiness by limiting my desire rather than in attempting to satisfy them. Okay, that is what he said. Now, just a brief backgrounder of who John Stuart Mill is. He was considered a genius. Okay, Mill has an economist father, and his autobiography shows that he has been reading history books from the age of 6, and he can speak English and Greek at 7. And he became a logician and economist at the age of 12 and 16, respectively. Now, he continued Bentham's legacy, okay, and generally credited for having popularized it. But as a utilitarian, okay, he lived its tenet and found that one of the secrets of happiness is the limitation of desire. Okay, that's the reason why he said here, I have learned to seek my happiness by limiting my desires rather than in attempting to satisfy them. Thus, if he does not have any purpose for the thing, he disposes it. Meaning, if he thinks that it's good, but it's not really purposeful, then he does not do it. However, we have to consider that John Stuart Mill differed from Bentham's view in many key ways. Okay, he does not agree with Bentham's idea that all pleasures are of equal value, because for him, it is not quantity that should be measured, but the quality of the pleasure felt. Okay? The pursuit of intellectual pleasure, according to Bentham, is deemed as better, okay, than the pursuit of physical or bodily pleasure. So it's not all about the pleasures that we get physically, but it's all about pleasure from our what? okay, intellectual musings. Perhaps he believes that different forms of pleasure should be ranked according to how valuable they are. But before that, let's look at how we try to understand the perspective of utilitarianism from the concept of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Now, when you talk about the concept of utilitarianism, at least for Jeremy Bentham, who was considered as the father of utilitarianism, it's all about quantity. Okay, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. However, when we talk about John Stuart Mill's concept of utilitarianism, it's not about the physical pleasure that one gets, but it's all about the quality. And when we speak of quality, it's all about intellectual pleasures. For Bentham, quantity of pleasure, meaning all pleasures are of equal value. But for John Stuart Mill, it's about quality of pleasure. Better be a dissatisfied human being than a pig satisfied. For Mill, intellectual pleasures are intrinsically more valuable than physical pleasures. Those who have felt both kinds will prefer definitely intellectual pleasures. Now, if we are going to look at your screen right now, just a very short activity you have to consider here from the list that you see here. What do you think would be considered by John Stuart Mill as a higher form of pleasure? Because again, when you talk about utilitarianism from the concept of John Stuart Mill, it is all about the quality of pleasure. It's all about intellectual pleasure, the intellectual musings of man, as opposed to the lower form of pleasure, which is physical pleasure and whatnot. So you have here number one, drinking beer. Number two, going to a classical music concert. Number three, reading Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Number four, playing basketball. And number five, okay, praying. Okay, let's try to check here. And if I will be deciding from the list which meal would consider as a higher form of pleasure, perhaps I would place reading Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet would be the first one. Okay, that would be the higher form of pleasure, at least from the perspective of Mill, because it's all about the intellectual musings, the intellectual pleasure that we get. Okay, the second one, perhaps because um, you talk about contemplations and whatnot. Perhaps the second one would be praying. Okay, you talk about when you contemplate, when you pray, you contemplate. So you try to connect with the higher power and whatnot. And also, I would be ranking going to a classical music concert as the third higher form of pleasure. The fourth one would be playing basketball, and lastly would be drinking beer. Now, why did I make that decision? Because I have to consider Mill's concept of utilitarianism. It's all about intellectual pleasure. It's not physical pleasures that matters at all. And so now we will be continuing with the concept of utilitarianism in business. And when we talk about the utilitarianism in business, we are all about the balancing of profit and cost. Now, what is supposed to be understood here is that the measurement of what will be beneficial will always be at the cost of sacrificing something. Ciliada, okay, in Indusara Journal in 2016 said, let me explain to you based on my modest and humblest understanding of utilitarianism by using an analogy of ham sandwich, what you see on screen, and egg sandwich. To prepare and serve a ham sandwich, you will see and you have to sacrifice a poor pig's life to serve the majority of the consumers. Now, that is what you call utilitarianism. Now, Mill wrote in his book on liberty and wealth of the nation also the idea of laissez-faire. Okay, now laissez-faire is found in businesses. Now, this idea promotes minimal interference from the government. They can have the liberty of choosing what to do with their business, and the only way that the government will step in is when such liberty causes violation of another person's rights and the protection of the state as a whole. Okay, this is the only fair treatment, which is called as the lazy fair. Thus, in business, it also means that making decision that will be beneficial to most, while at the same time perhaps minimizing the cost or the sacrifice. However, some debates consistently occur throughout history. You talk about the concept of layoff versus quality of products, job versus environment, or low salary versus more jobs, low cost quantity versus high quantity. Okay, so that is very important for us to understand in utilitarianism in business. And as we try to end our discussion on utilitarianism, as we wrap up, let me throw a question to you guys that perhaps many of you will be able to relate to. Now, in the movie The Avengers, Infinity War, okay, the Avengers Infinity War, we have the antagonist, Thanos, and Thanos wanted to rule the world in order to create balance that will ultimately save the world. However, in doing so, he will kill half of the world's population. Now, the question is, will you side with the Avengers to stop him, or will you let him do his plan, which is to create balance that will ultimately save the world? And this wraps up our discussion on the topic of utilitarianism. Again, this is still Hume 039 Ethics Course, and this is Sir E. I hope you learned something from our discussion today. Thank you very much. God bless you all, and I will see you around. Stay safe and stay healthy, everyone. Thank you.